Hello everybody and good morning, afternoon, or evening, whatever time you are doing your learning. Today's video is going to answer the question, what is poetry? Stay tuned to the end of the video where I'm going to read you one of my favorite poems. Let's get into the lesson.
English poet William Wordsworth describes poetry as the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. It takes its origin from emotion, recollected in tranquility. While this is a great definition of poetry, if you're not quite sure what it is, this isn't a great place to start. The main thing I want you to take from this quote, though, is that poetry and emotion are inseparable. Whether that emotion be joy, fear, anxiety, happiness, tranquility, any emotion can be expressed through poetry. And I hope you get to experience that as we read and write poems. To be a little bit more simple, a poem has qualities of both speech and song. This means that a poem is words and writing that has a meter and a rhythm to it. That's how the genre of rap got its name, which stands for rhythm and poetry. A poem is always rhythmical, meaning that it has a meter. There are lots of different names for the meters. We measure poetic meter in feet, while we measure song's meter in beats. And we're going to take a deep dive into that on the video about devices of sound. A poem is usually metaphorical, meaning that it has meaning beyond the literal. There are layers of meaning to a poem, which is part of the reason that I love them. A poem is composed of lines and stanzas. Just like an essay or a narrative has paragraphs, a poem has stanzas. First, you have the line in a poem, which is a segment of a poem that operates outside of traditional grammatical structures. You might not have a sentence in a poem, but you definitely have a line. You will also have stanzas. A stanza is a grouped set of lines in a poem set off by either blank lines or indentations. As we refer to and read poetry, these two terms are really important. In our short lesson on poetry, I want to end with this quote by Mary Oliver. She writes in her poetry handbook that poetry is a river. Many voices travel in it. Poem after poem moves along in the exciting crests and falls of the river waves. None is timeless. Each arrives in a historical context. Almost everything, in the end, passes. But the desire to make a poem and the world's willingness to receive it, indeed, the world's need of it, these never pass. I think there's a lot to unpack here. The three takeaways I have from this quote is first, that poetry, like other forms of literature, allow you to contribute to a collective voice of our society. Poems are trapped within their historical context, but they often always have meaning that can reach people beyond that context. And finally, the world needs poetry. Poetry throughout history has been a beautiful way for people to express themselves, for people to get messages out there, and just simply for people to understand their own emotions and to share those emotions with others. Thank you for listening to my lesson on poetry. The three things I want you to remember is that poetry is linked to emotion. Poetry always has rhythm and is often metaphorical. And finally, the world needs poetry. So let's keep learning about it.
Alright, so now that we've learned a little bit about what poetry is, I'm going to read you a poem. The poem I'm going to read to you is Wild Geese by Mary Oliver. You do not have to be good. You do not have to walk on your knees for 100 miles through the desert repenting. You only have to let the soft animal of your body love what it loves. Tell me about despair, yours, and I will tell you mine. Meanwhile, the world goes on. Meanwhile, the sun and the clear pebbles of the rain are moving across the landscapes, over the prairies and the deep trees, the mountains and the rivers. Meanwhile, the wild geese, high in the clean blue air, are heading home again. Whoever you are, no matter how lonely, the world offers itself to your imagination, calls to you like the wild geese, harsh and exciting, over and over, announcing your place in the family of things. Have a great day, everybody.